Welcome to the Korea Pro Podcast, your weekly guide to understanding the most pressing and complicated developments shaping South Korea. We're your hosts, Jeongmin Kim,
John Lei,
and Junha Park of Korea Pro.
Go beyond headlines as we explain not just what happened, but also what really matters and why it matters.
If you monitor South Korea for work or just trying to keep up, you're in the right place.
This is the Korea Pro Podcast. Welcome back, listeners, to Korea Pro Podcast. We are recording on May 21st, Thursday, a little bit after 10:30, and today we are joined in the podcast studio by Ankit Panda. I always thought that we already had you in the podcast, but I guess it was just full circuit. And for the listeners who don't really know the start of Korea Pro, Ankit actually wrote for us from day one when we launched, a week before Yoon Suk-yeol administration inaugurated. Looking back, that was a great timing. So thank you, Ankit, for writing for us and helping us out at the time. And Ankit Panda is the Stanton Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Very long name. And let's start with some of the things that you already mentioned. How U.S. allies are not all the same, but there is a reference to allies this, allies that. That is one of my pet peeves as well. Actually, John and I were recently asked to speak at a conference about middle powers, but not just middle power, great middle power. And we were scratching our head what this actually means, not academically, but in the real world right now since January, what does that mean? And I guess when the conference organizer thought about that word, it might have been something about middle powers, somewhere in the middle, who have leverages, certain leverages in defense, industrial, like econ, whatever, to wield I guess, against greater powers in minilaterals with other middle powers, I guess. I think that's what they meant, maybe Canada, Australia, I'm not sure. But what's your sense? What groups of allies are there that you often have to talk about?
Yeah, sure. So, when we talk about the 34-ish allies, and I use that number because that's technically...
Why ish?
Ish, because there's some ambiguities, do you include the Philippines in that list? If you're talking about kind of nuclear extended deterrence guarantees, which are mostly the allies that, I think about. But when you look at NATO, for instance, right, collection of 31 allies plus the United States, the set of countries within NATO, obviously, some are far more important to how the U.S. makes decisions about NATO security, allied assurance, et cetera, right? Germany and Montenegro, not kind of in the same bucket when it comes to influencing American thinking. This has obviously been a huge topic of anxiety, I think, here in Korea, right?
Sure.
Vis-a-vis Japan, especially, where there's been this perception that the United States will perhaps treat Korea differently from how it treats NATO allies or treats Japan.
Especially Japan,
right?
Or the way the United States treated South Korea before.
Yeah. And I think the honest answer is from an American perspective, there are differences in diplomats will never say that, right? There's the linchpin, the cornerstone, et cetera, the carefully
ironclad.
The carefully managed politics of keeping these alliances ironclad. But at the end of the day, each alliance looks very different. I mean, to which I often point out, by the way, in Europe, in Japan, there's a lot that's enviable about the Korea relationship, right? The Combined Forces Command is extremely unique. The historical legacy post-Korean War.
The entire UNC is here.
Entire UNC. And so just the software that exists in the Korea Alliance is actually really unique. And now we have had some software upgrades with the Washington Declaration and the last administration. Obviously, big question marks.
I'm going to get back to that.
We'll get back to that. Big question marks about where all that is going or where it even stands at the moment. But, on your question about middle powers or great middle powers, I mean, the way I sort of think about this is actually, I like to think about swing powers, kind of countries that if they change their alliances would actually be a major, would cause a major shift in their regions geopolitically, right? So if Korea... Korea is very clearly, I think, in that category where, I think it's clearly aligned with the United States, but longer term, if Korea were to reach a breaking point with the United States as an ally and longer term make a calculation that the economic gravitational pull of China is just so vast that even if Koreans have many problems with China, which we know from public opinion data they clearly do, that that could be a way forward for Korea to seek security in a more dangerous environment. I think that's a minority view because I think many people would prefer to build their own nuclear weapons before they did that. But those are some of the decisions that I think shape the ways in which these countries traditionally have been able to make decisions. And so when we talk about swing powers, I think it's really interesting to look at a country like Canada right now.
Oh yeah.
Right. So Canada, it has taken this under Mark Carney. Trump called his predecessor Justin Trudeau governor repeatedly. threatened Canada with becoming the 51st state against the will of the Canadian people. Very anomalous from the long history of U.S.-Canada relations, right? The U.S.
But logical if you look at recent context.
Yeah. I mean, it's often, like when South Koreans look north, they see North Korea. When Americans look north, they see Canada. And our geography is extremely blessed. 2 oceans, Mexico and Canada for neighbors. I think it's a huge part of the tremendous kind of security the United States enjoys, through the homeland. So it's not that Canada is becoming an enemy or anything like that. It's just clear that under Mark Carney, Canada is litigating long-standing assumptions about what its relationship with the United States should look like. And the reasons for that, I think, are internally contested in Canada, of course. Whether or not this gambit by Mark Carney, the speech he gave in Davos, where he kind of declared the rules-based order to have been a bit of a sham, which I think was problematic in a number of ways.
Right?
Yeah. But, that's very much contested. And if you look at kind of the debates that are happening here in Northeast Asia, where Japan and South Korea are in some ways, kindred spirits in the moment. I mean, so many differences between these countries, the physics and the realities of, everything we understand in terms of what should be possible between a Takaichi-style government in Tokyo and an Lee Jae-myung-style government in Seoul.
Which, by the way, it's amazing to look at how they are actually.
It's like the laws of Northeast Asian political physics are being broken in a way, right?
Yeah.
And it's quite remarkable that I think all of that is happening in response to the forces coming out of Washington. And so, to kind of tie everything I've just said together, many of the allies are I think they're having different reactions to this moment, right? It depends, if you're a European ally and you're worried about nuclear deterrence of Russia, right? You have France and the UK who have nuclear weapons. They're not the same kinds of nuclear weapons as the United States, but they are independent powers, independent centers of decision-making. Canada is, of course, in NATO, but a bit of a different picture because they're bordering the United States, so economically dependent, have had these long-standing assumptions about what the U.S. would be. And then you come here to East Asia, Korea, Japan, Australia, very, very different types of conversations. But, the Plan B conversation is I think, the most interesting one as these countries kind of reason about how they should view the United States, right? And we should zoom out here to also say that a lot of this goes beyond Trump 2.0, right? If you look at kind of what's happening in American politics between, let's say, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and some of the other, Kamala Harris, some of the other Democrats that might be, Democrats or Republicans that might inherit the presidency of the United States. I think it's clear that you have a new generation of American strategists, thinkers, politicians that are litigating the role the U.S. should play in the world. And so I think it's this really interesting moment looking at how countries are trying to navigate this. One of the answers I think all the allies share in common is they're all trying to build more defense autonomy, right? If you can't rely on the United States, you better arm yourselves to the teeth. Korea's obviously had a huge head start here, given that that's been a huge impetus of Korean defense policy for a long time with the United States. But now the questions about what that leads to longer term, I think, are very interesting.
I'm trying to remember all of the 10,000 things I wanted to follow up on you. But first of all, it's interesting you mentioned Australia in the context of East Asia. When you were mentioning East Asia, you said Korea, Japan, Australia. What is Australia to a lot of East Asian U.S. allies?
Yeah, I mean, look,
what's its utility?
East Asia is huge, right?
Yeah.
We talk about, I've always hated the Indo-Pacific construct in Washington, not because it's not a useful framing device, but you're talking about...
Too long for me in a headline,
the way I often say is that depending on how you draw your map of the Indo-Pacific, it is literally half the globe.
Yeah.
And so one of my pet peeves about strategy in Washington is that strategy is about, finite means and finite ends.
Yeah.
And so when you draw these kind of vast conceptual maps of an Indo-Pacific that's huge, you're kind of failing to actually prioritize or failing to be clear in a way. So, yeah, I mean, look, I think it's contestable whether Australia... I was just using that as shorthand, right? I mean, the geography problem is real, right? Korea and Japan are much closer to China and North Korea than the Australians.
But tactically, they have, they have reasons to be better friends now, right? That's what I mean. Australia, Japan, and South Korea, and New Zealand.
100%. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, this is, I think, a useful segue maybe to talking a bit about epic fury and the war against Iran, because since the war started, I've been in Tokyo. I was in Seoul, and this is my second trip to Seoul since the war started. And I've also spoken, I haven't been to Australia, but spoken with quite a few Australians visiting DC and outside. And it's clear that I think, this is not a surprise. Epic fury is going to have irrecoverable effects on U.S. defense readiness in the Indo-Pacific through 2030, right? So whatever your net assessment might have been for how a U.S.-China conflict might have played out before up to 2030, before the war started, now needs to be revised significantly downward because everything from missile defense interceptors to precision strike systems have been spent down. That's not a novel observation at this point, but it's important, and it's something that I think expert strategist officials in Seoul, Tokyo, and Canberra have observed acutely.
Yeah.
And so the networking that's happening between these countries, and the most notable here, it is really Japan and Australia that are doing a lot of networking bilaterally. Korea, of course, is having these debates, within itself about how far does Korea want to be pulled in to kind of Indo-Pacific questions, right? Strategic flexibility.
Yeah, I think South Korea has been tiptoeing forever about that.
Yeah, tiptoeing, sitting on the fence.
And going its own way, really. And I'm glad that you brought up Epic Fury, because just yesterday we saw this VLCC, a very large crude carrier tanker, move away from the Strait of Hormuz toward Ulsan. And the route that they took, the maritime route, is the one that Iran insisted on. And when that tanker moved, it moved the same route that Chinese tankers have been moving. Now, according to the Treasury Department, it's not just about paying the tolls to Iran. It's also about using Iranian-insisted routes that America is really also annoyed about. And so far, I've not heard of any response from Washington about this latest move from South Korea. And so we've already been seeing cracks in the alliance, haven't we? Where South Korea is now saying, yes, we want to remain aligned with the U.S., but if our energy security is going to be under constant pressure, then we might have to align away from the U.S. in some instances. Have you seen any sort of moves from D.C. regarding this?
I haven't. And I think, you raised something really interesting here about this whole war, right? I mean, the U.S., look, the entire world is hurting. This is a seismic energy shock to the entire global system. Doesn't matter if you're a rich country, poor country, how integrated you are with global supply chains, it's affecting you. But you can make an argument that from the perspective of American allies like South Korea, the negative effects have disproportionately fallen far from American shores in many ways, right?
As Pete Hegseth has said many times.
Exactly. And so it's hard for me to kind of take a step back and look at everything and not empathize fundamentally with the allied position, right? United States starts a war that creates negative consequences for Indo-Pacific security because we spend a bunch of munitions and missile defense interceptors that we might need for a conflict that actually matters. I mean, I think this war was a terrible mistake, doesn't actually address the problem of Iranian nuclear weapons. And at the same time, we do harm to our allies' national security, economic security, et cetera, without any consultations on capabilities that might need to be reassigned. There was a whole kerfuffle here about interceptors being withdrawn from the Korean Peninsula. Last time I was here was when those stories were breaking and there was a lot of kind of ambiguity about what was actually happening or not happening. But again, the lack of transparency was the core problem.
Yeah.
So I think this gets to a point where a lot of the big picture questions within the alliance, and then there's the other question, what is the alliance? I think Korea hands in D.C. and folks who think about the alliance here will refer to the bilateral U.S.-Korea relationship as the alliance. And I actually think that that's a mistake because the alliance is something quite fundamentally distinct, right? It is really a security and defense partnership between the two countries about their shared interests on questions of, Korea and America are economic competitors in many areas. They have a complex history of negotiating and working through disagreements on a number of questions relating to economic and even people-to-people questions. And so you could argue like this Hormuz situation kind of falls into that category of issues, whereas the alliance itself is in a place where perhaps it can be insulated. I think that's true on some level, but it's also very difficult to make that argument because I often like to say that the fundamental building block of any alliance is ultimately about solidarity and trust, right? If a country that you think is your ally is taking decisions that harm your security, harm your interests, it's difficult to then allow for good things to happen upstream in the security and defense realms. Going back to strategic flexibility for a second, though, I think there's a second thing that's happening, and this, again, I think it predates Trump 2.0, it predates Jeongmin. I think it's been happening since geopolitics in this part of the world have been shifting in a way that's gotten the United States very interested in the China dynamic and Taiwan in particular. And this gets at, what is the alliance between the two countries? It is a give and take relationship between two sovereign equals. And if you read the Mutual Defense Treaty, it doesn't name an enemy. It creates an equal obligation for both the United States and South Korea to defend the other if their security or sovereignty is under threat. And so from the vantage point of Washington, what this has meant is that Korea is now being viewed as a country that can provide benefits to the United States. And that's very different from kind of where the alliance has really been since the end of the Cold War, whereas it's been kind of a supplier relationship where the United States supplies Korea with assurances, extends deterrence. But now the conversation that's often had in official settings and in expert settings is if American sovereignty and territory is attacked, like Guam, right? Very concretely, Guam is U.S. territory that a lot of Americans think would face an attack if a major high-intensity conflict broke out. Technically, that would create a mutual defense treaty obligation then for South Korea to participate in that conflict, right? Regardless of kind of the kind of comfort levels that exist here about being pulled into a Taiwan conflict, having to posture, signal in ways that would create friction with China in peacetime. But what this means fundamentally is that because the security situation, the geopolitics of these issues have changed in East Asia, the alliance is entering this new uncomfortable period where these are questions that now have to be talked about. And it's not as easy as going back or just hoping that the alliance can remain primarily focused on North Korea, that the U.S. can be the supplier of assurances and extended deterrence guarantees, even though those are important. But it's more about, how do you get Korea to play that role that hasn't really been asked of Korea in a very long time, at a time when many Koreans, I think, have a very different set of threat perceptions for the United States.
Exactly. And I think it comes with an irony. One of the things that you mentioned, autonomy, the defense asset and capability building that's happening in a lot of U.S. allies. If the U.S. sees South Korea as capable enough now to help the United States when its sovereignty is infringed by someone, that's like a double-edged sword, right? To train your conscript soldiers better, the integration of the AI system into the military system, developing the assets, investing in the assets, and all of these, by the way, were mentioned in the NDS, saying, South Korea is very capable, so they're a model ally. They should be, doing the most of the conventional deterrence, aside from the limited and critical ones that U.S. would go for. And the Hormuz situation happened, and then U.S. is looking at South Korea as someone very capable of actually coming for help.
Yeah.
Isn't this an irony, and is this happening to any other countries?
I mean, so look, the administration, I'm glad you brought up the NDS and kind of the Bridge-Colby line on conventional versus nuclear.
Who,
right?
by the way, mentions South Korea all the time.
All the time,
as
yeah.
like model ally.
Yeah.
More.
So I think there's a fundamental illogic here that I want to pull on. Extended deterrence is really, really hard for the United States. Right?
Yeah.
We're telling all of these countries separated from us by oceans that basically we would fight a nuclear war for them, right? It's a crazy promise to make. It's really hard to make it credible, which is
Washington
why,
Declaration.
Yeah, so which is why, we do all these things, which is why during the Cold War, we forward deployed nuclear weapons to Korea. We deployed nuclear weapons to
Some countries
Central
wanted
Europe.
as constant basis, like Yoon said before.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. The unsinkable aircraft carrier narrative, et cetera. I mean, for the longest time, actually, there were some war games in D.C. where over Taiwan, and literally the Korean Peninsula, South Korea would just be an island because North Korea was left out of the game entirely. So they just wouldn't even draw the northern part of the peninsula. So like South Korea was literally in certain game settings.
It was a floating aircraft carrier.
Exactly. Floating aircraft carrier, right?
Is that realistic?
No, completely unrealistic.
Okay.
Completely unrealistic, right? But the point I was making about conventional deterrence, and I think this is an illogic in the Trump administration's approach to these issues, which is that, first of all, allies cannot change overnight, right? And this is less of a problem for Korea because Korea is, I think, uniquely capable for handling its own security challenges compared to many of our other allies. Obviously, in the context of OPCON transfer, this is a huge issue too, right?
Oh,
so
there was news this morning, by the way.
Sorry to open that can of worms. I know it's everybody's favorite topic. But
Now South Korea wants the second phase done by the end of the year and have entire thing completed by sometime next year. Apparently.
Very ambitious, yeah.
Very ambitious.
This is what happens when you have
Brunson
one.
does not agree with that.
Yeah,
General Brunson is going to be very annoyed, in
Of
fact.
course. When you have one term, you have the politics of these issues, that temptation to push ahead moves. But anyways, we have too many things going on right now. Let me pull back to the conventional deterrence thing. So the first thing is allies can't change overnight, right? And so this is a much bigger issue in Europe where, if anybody's been tracking, right, the Europeans are spending so much more on national defense. The Germans are going to be outspending France and the UK combined by the end of this decade on an annual basis. And that's great. But that means that you basically need to give the allies about 10 years, right? It's kind of a sunsetting plan. If you sort of fly to, you fly to the Munich Security Conference, you fly here to Seoul, to Tokyo, and you start saying the U.S. is going to do less conventionally because our allies are getting more capable, that has to correlate to reality, right? Because conventional deterrence on some level is affected by the capabilities allies can really bring to bear.
Exactly.
The second problem is the reason the U.S. has actually been traditionally very interested in conventionally defending allies is not because we're nice. It's because it actually allows the U.S. to have tremendous say in the scale, tempo, and intensity of escalation in a conflict, right? And so imagine the Korean Peninsula where the decisions very early in a conventional clash with North Korea are being made entirely without any consultation with Washington here in Seoul, right? From the perspective of the United States, that actually creates some really dangerous dynamics because it means that, kill chain type strikes on North Korean command and control or launchers
Which we
that
almost
happen.
saw recently, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so the conflict could escalate in a way that creates a massive problem.
We
for
already
Washington.
saw that during Yeonpyeong, right?
Exactly. And so this is so like Yeonpyeong is actually a great example of that because back then the perception was that the U.S. was too scared of escalation. We actually held back the Myung-bak administration in ways that prevented escalation. But it should again be a reminder of why participating in Allied conventional defense is not just this giveaway to allies. It actually buys the United States influence in managing our alliances. And the third dynamic kind of relates to what I've just said. It's the kind of fundamental incoherence. I think this is really the key issue, right? It goes back to that crazy promise at the heart of extended deterrence that we'll fight a nuclear war for you. We never want that promise to ever be tested, right? We don't even want our allies to really have to think about that issue, ideally. Like from my perspective is Allied assurance works best when allies think as little as possible about those scary nuclear scenarios. Which obviously here in Korea, there's been a lot more thinking about that, just given what's happened with North Korea over the last decade. But by saying that you're going to pull out conventionally because allies are getting more capable, whether or not that's true or not, right? It's true for Korea, maybe not true for Europe.
Even if they don't pull out,
when
they say it.
Yeah, it increases the probability of conventional deterrence failure, which means it increases the probability of an intense conventional conflict. Which means it also increases the probability that your allies in planning for those intense conventional conflicts where nuclear weapons are implicated on the other side, right, with North Korea, with China, with Russia, are going to start asking more questions of the United States on nuclear reassurance. And so it's basically the U.S. digging itself into a hole where we actually worsen the alliance management problems for ourselves, right? And these are problems that don't have easy solutions. Like the U.S., we're not the country we were during the Cold War. We can't just manifest, thousands of tactical nuclear weapons to deploy to Europe and Asia. It's a very different world today, right? In terms of the norms around those things, the NPT system, a lot of the deployments that happened in the Cold War predated the NPT. So it's a very short-sighted approach that I think focuses on the pressure that exists politically right now, really coming from the White House to cut costs, essentially, when it comes to alliances. But again, there's all these other issues that factor into this. And the last thing, point number 4, I guess, is that all of this, I think, contributes to an environment where allies are going to talk more about nuclear weapons, right? Because it just creates that fundamental distrust that very rationally, right? Again, I'm opposed to allies building nuclear weapons, but I understand very logically, like why, if you were an ally and you were in this position, you would have that debate. And that's exactly what we're seeing.
And point number 5, I guess the follow-up question is, what kind of message does this send to shared adversaries?
Well, so I think it undermines...
Although shared adversaries, what is it these days?
Different allies care about different adversaries. More or less, right? So like North Korea is obviously, there's one ally that cares a lot about North Korea, South Korea. And, obviously NATO cares less about China and North Korea. Japan cares more about China, also cares about North Korea, et cetera. But the message here, I think, is not a good one, right, for deterrence. You could actually make the argument that maybe the U.S. could have used this to try to create like new assurances for adversaries, but that's not what the Trump administration is doing. Assurance is different from what we tell our allies, more just about assurances about avoiding conflict, for instance, right? So maintaining deterrence while communicating to our adversaries that we don't want to invade them or attack them or anything like that. So one of the ways you might see that is by saying, well, hey, North Korea, we're going to do less exercises that look like we're going to decapitate your leadership or plan for a major invasion of your territory. That's not really what's happening. So it doesn't send, I think, a very coherent signal. And again, I think incoherence is the fundamental problem with a lot of what's happened, right? I mean, going back to the NDS and the NSS. I mean, if you read those documents, you would not have seen epic fury coming, right? And so I would receive all these delegations in DC from all these allies, and they came before the NDS, before the after the NDS and NSS, and they'd read those documents so closely, right? They'd annotated them. And they were
we analyzed it too.
Well, everybody, you have to, right? Because but that's the
Like
old
reading
way.
between lines.
Yeah, that's the old way of understanding Washington, right? It worked for Biden, it worked for Trump 1.0, even when those documents were somewhat taken seriously.
When the older guys would edit them, basically.
But now it's like there's exactly one policy planning official, and that's the president.
Yeah.
And his decision making is all over the place. And so even on these questions, I think the kind of base level about how you sort of should think about these going forward, I think it's entirely detached from what we're actually seeing, and it's really an attempt by, I think, the Pentagon to convert Trump's high-level guidance on alliances into some type of workable policy, but it has a lot of kind of negative consequences in my view.
2 questions to sort of try to wrap up now.
Sure.
One would be, what changed the most when you come visit Seoul and talk to people here, stakeholders, whatnot, compared to a year ago, I guess? And
Or 2, really.
Or 2. My second question would be, you mentioned that all of this might outlive Trump.
Yeah.
What would this mean for the U.S.-South Korea alliance afterward? Like, what kind of alliance do you imagine?
Well,
it's kind of a linked question.
Yeah, the first question is kind of an easy one because of the political changes here, right?
Oh, yeah, that's true.
So it's always, it's one of the really fun things. That's one of the reasons I love working on Korea, is because when these changes happen, it's complete whiplash in a way, right? You go from the Yoon administration and kind of
NCG and Washington
deterrence. Big focus on hawkish policy towards North Korea, and then now Lee Jae-myung, coexistence, peace,
two
engagement,
states.
2 states. But I think it's really, really important to also note here that many of the conversations don't really change that much, right? Around the fundamental kind of analytical work that I do on North Korea and nuclear dynamics. There's equally unsettling kind of analytical takeaways for both camps, essentially, in Korea. Like a lot of Korean progressives, for instance, are surprised to find that my views on engagement with North Korea have changed, right? Because I'm fundamentally, I think there was a window of opportunity that has now fundamentally shifted, and I think North Korea is a fundamentally different country now than it was a few years ago in many ways. But it's not a North Korea podcast, so we're not going to get into that. Actually, I talked about that on the other podcast that you all do here.
And go check it out.
Yeah, exactly. So if people are interested in why I think that, there's answers there. And the second question, I think, is the really big one. It's one I obviously don't have an answer for, but look, I think. Well, let me open with this, right? Korea building nuclear weapons. I think that is a higher probability outcome than it was 10 years ago. I still think it's a low probability outcome in absolute terms, right? So I don't think Korea is going to go nuclear unless there's like a very fundamental moment of discontinuity.
I imagine people ask you a lot.
Yeah. So something like a Korean Peninsula Cuban Missile Crisis, where the U.S. kind of objectively fails to deliver on its assurances in some way, and maybe that's a fatal event. Maybe it's kind of Kim Jong-il's succession leads to some kind of deliberate clash. Maybe like the Cheonan and Yonpyeongdo's shelling, and the U.S. acts the way it did back then, and that's just intolerable from the perspective of
something
the Korean
spirals,
public, and something breaks.
Yeah.
Beyond that, there's also been a shift in the either inability or refusal to send shipments to Europe. Can we expect to see that happening in Korea or Japan? And would that have a much more immediate impact on the alliance?
It's possible. I mean, anything is possible in these domains. I think there's less of a chance of that because the administration really does have it out for Europe in a way that they don't for Korea and Japan, right? I think that's been kind of the small piece of good news, is that there is, you saw this in the Signal leaks last year. They were privately among themselves talking about how much the Europeans free ride, et cetera. So I think it's a genuinely held belief among many of the core cabinet officials and senior
and more
decision
emotionally
makers.
charged.
Yeah, much more emotionally charged. So I think there's a possibility of that, but I think it's less obviously clear. But the second one, the second piece to this is all of the stuff about OPCON transfer, Korean defense capability, and enhancing Korea becoming a lot more autonomous with targeting, intelligence,
Modernization.
Some of the areas where the U.S. has traditionally been indispensable for Korea and for allied operations. I think it's going to mean that Korea is going to be a lot more capable of bargaining, right? I wrote a paper for the Washington Quarterly with Tristan Volpe a few years ago where we looked at everything that was happening in the Korean defense space, right? As allies become more autonomous and credible and capable on their own, their ability to bargain with Washington increases, in my view, right? And I don't think it's a very controversial argument. What does that bargaining entail? It means that if you get let's say, an internationalist Democratic president in 2029 who says, sorry about all that, sorry about Trump 2.0.
We love WTO.
Yeah. So it's kind of like Joe Biden redux, Biden's inaugural address, America's back. We're sorry for all of that.
Back again.
Yeah. And so it will actually put Korea in a place to bargain pretty forcefully, right? I don't know what the terms of that bargaining will be because, again, it depends if you have a
or what it
conservative
might be
president.
about.
Yeah, but if you have a conservative administration and they want like B-61 nuclear weapons to come to the Korean Peninsula, I actually think Korea is going to be very well positioned to have that argument or have that demand to be made of Washington in a much more credible way. And similarly with progressives, we were just talking about the timeline on OPCON, the longer term approach to managing North Korea. Some of those things I think could also be equally open to moving. And then the allies themselves, I think, by networking unilaterally, can collectively increase the bargaining power, right? So here I think is the big opportunity. Like if I had to kind of give a core recommendation to anybody listening to this,
which is all of the countries you mentioned, by the way.
Yeah, like non-Americans fundamentally, right? I think planning to manage the United States in the future after this moment, whatever that future looks like, right? It might be J.D. Vance, might be Kamala Harris, might be somebody else. I don't know. But banding together as allies and actually having a common core bargaining position on some of the key big picture questions, maybe, and those questions are very different viewed from Europe and viewed from Asia. Again, we'll position those allies to, I think, get something out of Washington. And the final thing I'll say here is the U.S. might not be able to deliver on a lot of that, right? Because for reasons I've already alluded to, like industrial constraints in our nuclear enterprise, right? Like the U.S. is trying to build new capabilities now. These were in recent budget documents. We don't really know what they are, but what the U.S. could meaningfully bring to the table on nuclear assurances, conventional capabilities, there's really, I think, very little slack to sort of change those dramatically at the margin. So TBD, but I think it's going to be a really, really interesting set of questions. I mean, for me, this is really, I think, where my research agenda is really going to focus. I think for the next, through the end of this decade, I think it's just going to be a really fascinating thing to observe.
And who should be the leader in coordinating that co-bargaining position? Gun to your head. This is Korea Pro podcast, but you don't have to say South Korea.
I actually
don't think it's South Korea. But
I don't think there can be a leader per se. I think there's too many differences, right? All of the allies are
one of the points that we mentioned earlier on.
Yeah, exactly. All the allies are different. They all bring different types of capabilities to the table. I think it also depends, again, going back to the question of how do you think about alliances fundamentally? Like, are we talking about things like semiconductors and kind of,
economic security,
or
Patriot?
That's not really my department. So I think I don't talk about those things too much, but I think they are often kind of brought into these conversations. But I was talking just more strictly on the, defense and security, pushing out kind of A2AD bubbles into the Taiwan Strait and deterring conflict, et cetera.
Yeah.
Where Korea is on that is very different politically from where Japan and Australia are, but the capabilities Korea brings to the table are very different. So I think it's really, first of all, the way to start answering this question, I'm being very diplomatic here, but I genuinely don't think that there's an obvious leader, right? I think it's about getting the allies into a room without Americans to actually have these conversations. And I know these are happening bilaterally, but the more I think these can be minilateralized or multilateralized, I think there's...
that was a very diplomatic answer, but I do want to get an answer out of it. So maybe it's hard to say normatively who should be the leader. So let's frame it a little differently. Which country or which groups of countries do you think has the most influence to be in that leadership position?
Or capability, scoreboard.
Capabilities don't give you that kind of leadership heft, right? Korea has all this capability, but Korea's actually been very conservative about leading on these big regional questions, right? This is like Korea has famously not wanted to, the T word, Taiwan. Like we're finally having those conversations now.
But they want G8.
But it was exactly. So there's kind of this. I think you're highlighting kind of the mixed signals you sometimes get. You
Yeah.
know, being a global pivotal state, G8, whatever you want to call it, like Korea has these aspirations
Join the
to be.
Quad, AUKUS Pillar 2.
Yeah, and so I think there is kind of a prestige seeking that kind of explains that.
Rather than leadership.
But what I'm really describing would require a country like Korea to be a lot more forward-leaning on knowing exactly what are its core strategic concerns around Taiwan, being able to articulate those clearly, being able to talk about those things in ways that would probably upset China, right? Is that something Korea wants to invite risk on? Because again, there is no reward without risk in geopolitics, right? And so you have to be open to that type of risk. And that's a decision for Korean governments to make, but I think there are benefits to this longer term, just given the uncertainties that I see at the moment. Japan, similarly, you know, very forward-leaning politically. Obviously, Takaishi's been in a lot of hot water with China on these issues, but on the kind of software and hardware side of defense and security, Japan is still relatively new to this party, right? Post 2022 national security strategy, they are getting their house in order, deploying new capabilities, but Korea's had a huge head start here. So, like, really, I just don't think that, you know, it's a clear answer of who can lead. And
How about Canada?
Yeah, Canada is nowhere. I mean, I think it's just such a different place.
So
right?
we just love provoking our
Yeah,
guests.
geopolitically and you know, just in terms of threat perceptions. But I will note here, I mean, you know, like the Mark Carney approach is not a very popular one here in East Asia.
That's interesting to
and
me.
I think it's seen
behind
as
closed doors, you mean?
Yeah, and I think it's seen as a way for, or at least it's seen as an unrealistic solution for countries that don't see a real plan B without the United States for themselves. Even like leaving aside the question of building your own nuclear weapons.
Something that sounds good but does not apply well here.
Well, it's less about sounding good. It's more like kind of Canada through Carney seeking some sort of catharsis, because obviously, like, a lot of what the Trump administration has done is very upsetting to allies, right? And so allies, I think, have this kind of repeatedly, I think, have this internal conversation that, you know, we should just give the United States the middle finger.
Yeah.
And it would feel
And
really
Munich Security Conference loved Carney's speech.
Yeah.
He was the superstar.
Exactly. And so Mark Carney is kind of the poster child for very diplomatically giving the United States the middle finger in a way that I think invites catharsis. Like, it makes, I think it's certainly helped the Liberal Party in Canada. It's created this narrative that, you know, Carney is maybe leading a new coalition of middle powers, et cetera. And I think the jury is genuinely out on that. But I think from the perspective of what I hear, at least in Seoul, Tokyo, Canberra, it just doesn't work in this part of the world. Like, you cannot, you just don't have the luxury of seeking that type of catharsis with the United States. Even if your energy prices are rising and your economy is hurting, and, you know, you have deep concerns about extended deterrence and insurance, there's just no plan B.
Yeah. And
So,
I would look forward to reading about this on Korea Pro for your next story that you will file to John. And if you want to read more what Ankit might have been writing about recently about the nuclear deterrence and the new age of American alliances, check out carnegieendowment.org. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And thank you, Ankit, for joining us in a very short trip to Seoul.
Thanks for having me. Always fun.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in.
If you want to know more, sign up for our daily executive briefings. We'll brief you on all you need to know from the past 24 hours and why it matters, delivered to your inbox every morning.
If you want to stay ahead of the curve, sign up for Korea Pro to get a full package of insights, from daily expert analysis to profiles, month in review, week ahead, and more.
And until next time, I'm Jeongmin Kim.
I'm Junha Park.
And I'm John Lee, and we'll see you next time on the Korea Pro Podcast.